Welcome everyone to Mailfuzz TV. I am Peter and today I'm going to be talking about Station 11 Episode 5. It's called the Severn City Airport. So spoilers for the episode as always. And this is of course a sponsored review, so thank you to Alison over on Patreon for picking this show. Much like I expected, just based on the cadence of the episodes, this is another episode that is set in the past. This is a focused story largely revolving around Clark, which is Arthur's old acting friend, and also Arthur's second wife, Elizabeth, who he'd also divorced from and had a son with. And it's them being stuck at an airport in Michigan. They were on their way to Chicago because Arthur's death to deal with it in various ways. But the flight was redirected and grounded, and they effectively end up stuck in the airport, like the terminal, but because of the apocalypse happening and kind of that slow realization that this is the new normal, that the world's not just going to be fixed in a couple of days. This is what it is, and the story takes place over about a month or so of time. I was looking forward to this episode because I really enjoyed episode 3, which focused on Miranda, and I felt like this episode focusing on another character or two in this very direct way was something I was enjoying more than the future traveling playgroup. Like I feel like I'm not as into that future stuff as I am this stuff, and that's kind of weird. Actually, it's weird to be more into the backstory building than I am the ongoing present story. So, well, it's good in the sense that I went into this episode happy and I came out of it mostly happy. Although I do have one kind of sad critique about it. I'm not that looking forward to the next episode now because I know I'm getting back to the future stuff. I know I'm getting back to all the stuff with the prophet and the danger, and it might get better, don't get me wrong. I might be more into it next episode than I have been thus far, but in this weird way, because it is slingshotting between two very different parts of the story, there's such a structure to it going backwards and forwards. There's nothing wrong with that inherently, but because I'm liking one side of it much more than the other, it does mean that now I'm on the downswing, because now I'm going back into the other episode at the end of this one. But hey, that's just a thought for the show as a whole, for the story as a whole. Looking at this episode on its own, I like most of what this episode is. I like the idea of this community forming in the airport because they're all stuck there together after they've been grounded for some time and they can't leave because basically clearly they're trying to make everyone not interact with anyone else, so everyone in the airport isn't sick, they're fine. But quite quickly there is this plane that lands and we hear that, oh no, the people on that plane are sick, so they're not allowed to leave the plane. So there's this kind of visual reminder out there in the tarmac the entire time that there's people dying. So you've got all these little ideas of how different people are going to manage in this new world. One, there's the realization from certain characters that we are in a new world and that we have to actually start thinking about this as the new normal. But you've also got one of the most interesting ideas in this episode to me is a character who takes advantage of it to become more important. There's a character going around in a Homeland Security jacket, and he's saying that he's recruiting people for a mission, useful people, and it kind of sounds like, okay, we're in the post-apocalypse and someone's looking for anyone who has skills for something. But Clark, who's kind of our main character in this episode, just randomly stumbles into evidence halfway through the episode because he doesn't want to use the bathroom because the bathroom's not being cleaned, so it stinks. So he goes to this little bathroom that's in a staff area, and he just happens to find that this guy who's been pretending to be an agent is actually just the custodian at the airport who's telling everyone that he's an agent, that he's trained, that he's taking them on this thing. And he ends up running away with a pilot and a lot of young women. There's a soccer team that were on the plane with Clark, and most of them, except the goalie, go away. And that's a big turning point about halfway through the episode where Clark makes a big speech about how, hey, this actually helped us because they're idiots. They've effectively just tripled our food supply by leaving. We have shelter, we have all these things, we can make a life out of this. And that's where they start to form some sort of structure. Up until that point, they're all just kind of aimlessly hanging around. And then all of a sudden, it's like, oh no, this is actually kind of a community now that's forming. And Clark recognizes that. So anyway, all of that stuff I actually really like. If I have a critique about any of that, it's almost that it's a shame that we didn't get to explore this idea that someone just lied about who they were before to suddenly be important now. And then the flip side of that is that Elizabeth, Arthur's ex-wife, and Tyler's mum, she went from being famous, and at the start of the episode, she gets to kind of shoo away Clark as she's like, oh, he's just a fan, be gone. And she's very uptight. She doesn't want to talk to anyone. She looks uncomfortable when a fan asks for a selfie, all that kind of thing. And then all of a sudden, in the post-apocalypse, that fame is meaningless. It doesn't matter anymore. She's not important anymore. Her private jet isn't coming. These shifts, these paradigm shifts, and the idea that someone could be an opportunist and become the important person by just lying, and there being very little infrastructure now to actually prove that they're lying, is a fascinating idea to me. How can people use that and manipulate it? So if I have any complaints, it's almost that I wish we explored the idea that he'd been lying more. Although him running away with a bunch of characters who have been hoodwinked into his scheme does obviously lead Clark to make his big speech, and it inspires everyone else to get on board with it. But still, I almost wish I could have seen a bit more of that. I'll get more into the other details and stuff. The thing that I wasn't as keen on in this episode, though, the thing that didn't quite work for me, is Tyler, as the kid, right? Who, by the end of this episode, it's made very abundantly clear that this is the prophet. That the character who's been dangerous in the future stuff is Arthur's son. And he grew up with that book. We knew that Arthur sent him a copy of it. In fact, we see him get that book in this episode. We see him get it as a present from the mum, Elizabeth, and he unwraps it. And we see his first times reading this book. It's hard to diagnose exactly my problem here, because I'm not sure if it's all on the child acting. I think some of it is. Not necessarily because the kid's a bad kid actor, but more maybe because he wasn't directed correctly, perhaps. But I do think there might be something here in the script where I think the kid's growing attitude and the idea that he's going to have all these extreme views, and he suggests things throughout the episode like maybe we shouldn't repopulate the world, because everyone else, like Clark says, hey, of course it's up to us to repopulate the world, and Tyler, and in fact it's the first line of dialogue he has in the episode, I think, he's quiet the rest of the time. He's just this quiet kid who's not paying attention, although Clark, I think, rightly suggests that he is paying attention more than he lets on, but he's keeping out of everything. One of the first things in the episode that he says is, should we? And he's like, should we what? Repopulate. Should we do that? And then that kind of starts this idea. He's also, at one point, he's downloading Wikipedia on his, I think it's a Lynx. It's a handheld gaming thing. I think it's a Lynx. It's not one that I've used myself, but I think that's what he was using. But he's like, hey, he's got the Wikipedia page for capitalism. He's like, should I delete it? Right? Because the internet's basically gone. He was downloading all these useful pages beforehand. Things like instructions on how to do stuff with electrical equipment and stuff like that. Stuff that would be useful if people don't happen to know them in a post-apocalyptic world. For example, one of the other characters we get to know, Miles, who was a TSA agent, he ends up being the third leader of the group between Elizabeth, Clark, and him, and he's going to try and rig up all these solar panels because the airport was planning on installing them, so they're all in this big crate. So presumably some of the instructions on how to do that are coming from the internet and things like that. But and Elizabeth just says, oh, we'd only reinvent it again. You're not going to wipe it out just because you delete the Wikipedia page. We're not going to follow that to start capitalism again. It'll just happen naturally. I think there's something about the way Tyler goes in this episode, the way he interjects at certain points. I feel like it's all a little bit hokey. And like I say, I think part of it's maybe down to the performance, but I think a big part of it is the way it's written, because I was so into all of the forming of this new community and Clark taking charge and how they're sort of interacting with each other. And it doesn't get too much into the logistics of the survival. There's a little bit of that, don't get me wrong, those things come up. But what comes up more than that, particularly in Clark's speech, is just this idea of them as a community of people and how they have to be, willing to all be a community effectively. One of the first times he brings it up before this big speech even is when he goes out to get Elizabeth, who's outside waiting for her private jet to arrive. And it's been days at this point, and she's still out there. And he goes out and makes a point of saying, hey, to the people inside, this staying out here waiting for your jet implies that you'd rather be out here freezing than being a part of that community. And that scene comes before he makes his big speech about how they have to band together. But he gets to that point where he does say that, and it felt like it was focusing more on the idea of the human beings like living together as opposed to the, how are we going to get this or that, or they talk about the electricity a little bit. They talk about rationing the power, and that does come into it a touch, but it felt like it was shifting a bit more towards the people aspect of it. And there's a whole joke here where the only person from the girls' soccer team that didn't go with the guy was the goalie. And he throws in a couple of jokes about how the goalie's the important member of the team. Everyone wants the flashy striker, but it's the goalie who's important. And the goalie, and I don't even think him saying that was that funny to me, but it was the goalie like piping in saying, hell yeah, I am, or something like that, that I thought was amusing. So that aspect's all really good. The Tyler stuff, though, in comparison, was where it felt like, okay, I understand that we're doing an origin story for a character that we know later. But by the end of the episode, I didn't really feel like I don't feel like I got the story in this episode of how he's going to become the person he is in the future. I just kind of got the vibe that he was already that kid. Right? And it's maybe heightened by this new situation that he's went into. Like, it kind of feels like the relationship that he had with his mother, the relationship that he had with his father that just recently died, it feels like these relationships had already been set in stone by and large before this part of the story. So I don't really feel like I got like a solid arc out of the kid, other than just he's quiet and has these kind of radical, counter ideas to very simple things that come up, like repopulating the planet, like society coming back, that kind of thing. This kind of nihilistic doom and gloom, we have to like clean the slate for nature or whatever. That's the thing. I don't even know. Does he care about nature? Is this like an ultra eco-terrorist thing where he's like, oh, we must wipe out humanity because the wildlife and the natural order can take hold? Like, so far, I don't know if I've gotten that vibe from him, unless he said something that kind of implied that motivation back when we met him as an adult in like episode 2. But I don't remember him saying anything like that, which leads me to think it's more just a vendetta against human beings than it is about anything else. There's a whole big segment in this episode where he chooses to like walk away from everyone else, and he's like hanging out at the end of the walkway to the plane. There's no plane there, but he's just sort of dangling off the end of it. And he goes out to the plane when he sees someone come out of the infected plane, as it were. There's a man in there that's still alive, and he comes out the hatch. It's been a week or so since it landed at this point, maybe 10 days, I think, at this point. And he brings this man into the airport, and they're all kind of like having a party because they're kind of forming a community at this point. And they all freak out, of course, when they see this man, and they all back up. Miles pulls out his gun and tells him to stay back, but the man keeps moving forward, and Miles shoots him in the head. And everyone seems to be quite on board with that being the right course of action. Tyler's argument, though, is that this man must be immune, and everyone says we don't know if that's a thing or not. That may not be the case. And at this point, the gun's pointed at Tyler. Elizabeth runs out to hold him, and then they're like, hey, they might both be infected now, and they're raising this question. And Clark has to step in and say, look, we're not monsters, let's not do this. Let's quarantine them for like a week, and if they're showing no symptoms by then, because by all accounts, everyone who gets this virus dies within a day or two, so there's no need to drag it out. Although everyone's like a month. Right, we'll accept a month. So they go in quarantine in like a private jet that's in one of the hangars for a month. They're not allowed to leave or go with anyone else, but they've got power, they've got some food, they'll be fine. They even make them wear the mask when they come out the plane. But they seem to reintegrate just fine. And it seems to have proven that there are some people who are immune, which I think we as the audience have already kind of known that, just because it feels like there had to be some people who were immune. But this whole thing, of course, like it works to disillusion Tyler to everyone else because it almost feels like Tyler's been the sympathetic one to this like survivor who's come off the plane, only for the others to have killed him in fear that he's going to infect them and take away their new society that they've started to build, their new community. I don't know if it's enough for me to like really get on board with Tyler slash the Prophet as a character as of yet. I don't think I'm in love with him as a character in general in the present day stuff, and I don't think this backstory for him as a kid really did much to build it up for me. Especially since I think even like Clark at a certain point, like, you know, right before Tyler does his big thing at the end where he sets the infected plane on fire and lets everyone think that he's on board and that he's killed himself, right? And he walks off behind the flames to go be the man he's going to be. Right before that point, there's a whole thing where Clark is talking to Arthur, right? Because they set this up earlier on, and it was actually Tyler's idea to talk to their loved ones who they've lost over the comms in the radio tower and the air traffic control tower, which was set up again previously because Clark finds his way up there. Because at a certain point, there's no airport security. In fact, Miles, who starts off as a TSA agent, after like whatever time span it is, like maybe a few days later, he just kind of turns to Clark and says, "I quit my job a few hours ago, so I'm not here in an official capacity anymore. I'm just done." So, but anyway, it sets up this idea that everyone, like the airport's not being secured in the way it was when it was active. Now people are just roaming wherever they want, and it's just become a home for these people. So Tyler sets up this thing where the other kids are talking into the headset to their loved ones as if their dead loved ones can hear them. It's maybe this therapeutic thing. And it does feel like an example again of Tyler trying to do something that seems like a therapeutic, like, kind thing. Between this and between trying to save the man, you know, obviously the idea is that he gets very disillusioned with everyone, but this comes back later when Clark chooses to start talking into the headset to Arthur about how much he's struggling with Tyler and by extension Elizabeth, and that maybe it's time for them to go. Now, whether or not he really means that, whether or not he's actually going to try and like kick them out of the airport is a whole other question. The important thing here is that Tyler hears it all because he's got a walkie-talkie with him and he's talking into a radio, which did again, and they did set this up. This was good writing. They set up that when they've got walkie-talkies that can pick up what's being said in the control room into the microphones, which makes sense. Of course, there is. But they set this up earlier because Elizabeth was listening to all the kids make their heartfelt like messages and confessions into the radio. So they set it up earlier, and they paid it off here. You know, it's a decent scene. It's well acted. I don't know if I got to the point though where I really bought that Clark was struggling this much with putting up with them that he'd even say this. It felt like it kind of skipped a beat for me. Like, I get that, especially since I feel like him and Elizabeth had already like had a much healthier arc this episode, because the episode starts with them on the plane and he tries to shout over to say hello because he sees her and recognizes her, but she's been a celebrity. She just kind of ignores him. And he comes up, makes that sort of excuse to go up and talk to her and sort of make some small talk about the death of Arthur and speaking kind of softly about it and sort of as if they know each other, but Elizabeth clearly doesn't want him around. And then she says he's just a fan. We'll talk about who she said that to in a second, like, because there's another character here that we do have to talk about. And it felt like, again, when he went out to speak to her when she was out in the tarmac, she was like, yeah, I would rather be out here in the cold than be a part of that group. And it felt like when he made his big speech to everyone, that kind of drew Elizabeth in, and she realized that this is a community she has to be a part of if they have any chance of like some sort of long form survival or life. And it felt like from that point on, there was a more of a better working relationship. They were a bit cold. She did feel a little bit slighted that they had to quarantine for so long and put on the mask to make everyone else feel better and whatever. But, you know, when they had the party and she goes and gives the book to Tyler, and like, it felt like she was interacting with Clark well enough. It felt like they had reached this point where him, her, and Miles were all sort of equally kind of taking charge in some way, that I didn't quite buy that there'd been enough incidents with Tyler and her to for him to even voice this feeling by that point. It felt like it took a bit of a leap towards the end. And maybe that's just me, maybe other people won't feel that way. But I did feel like a bit of a leap there. Obviously, what Tyler does after this, where he sets the plane on fire, is absolutely enough to warrant it. But that comes next. That doesn't come before he makes this little speech. So, yeah, a little bit of a disconnect for me there. I should probably mention the conversation that Elizabeth has with Tyler when she gives him the book. She admits that Arthur had been reaching out to him with letters for the last couple of years, ever since they got the divorce, however long that was. And he asks why, and she admits that, she was being selfish and that she didn't want, them contacting each other. And she notes after this when she goes to talk to Clark, again, another example of at this point her and Clark being on much better terms and her not treating them like dirt. But she admits that Tyler can always tell when you're lying. And that's just like one of the qualities that he has, which, is something maybe we've seen some examples of from the adult version, the Prophet, and the future stuff. But again, I think it's another example though of him becoming disillusioned with the people around him. That he probably wanted contact from his father, and she made choices to withhold that. So it does feel like, yeah, they're setting up that he's a sociopath in some form. And maybe the big problem I have with Tyler as a character in this episode is that it feels like he's already the person that he is at the start, like I said. Whereas if he'd been more of a normal kid or had some hope or something in the first half, in these revelations actually felt like they did a number on him, like he actually changed after these moments, I might have felt the turn more. I might have felt like, okay, this is where these 2 or 3 moments where the man was shot that he was trying to help, where his mother admitted to these lies, to these things, right? Maybe all these things would have sold me on the idea that this is a major turning point for his character. But he feels just as like stoic and quiet at the start of the episode as he does by the end, in all honesty. And when it did the sort of the intercutting at the end between him now and him in the future watching the play to sort of just visually establish that it's the same character, it didn't make me any more excited about who he is in the future. It just kind of made me go, oh, he seems about as thin here as he does in the future stuff. So I'm a little unexcited about that character right now, and I'm not sure how I'm going to feel about him as the villain when we go back to the future stuff. Hey, I said Back to the Future without meaning to. Fun. Nice. Yeah, we have to talk about what's his face, Enrico Colantoni's character, who's Brian, who I'm noticing on the IMDb list here. So this was the character in the future who had been trying to invite the troupe to the Museum of Human History, or whatever the exact title was. And we see him in this episode. He's on the plane at the start of the episode, and he's working for Elizabeth. He's the one that says, is this guy bothering you, to Elizabeth? And she's like, oh no, he's just a fan, right? So we see him there, and what's interesting is that later in this episode, it's Clark who seems to start this museum, right? Not in a big way, but he puts out a few items, the gun, like a phone, something else, and when Elizabeth asks what he's doing, he's saying, hey, like the whole talking through the comms to the dead feels like, I get the point of it, but I feel like a more healthy way to look at the past would be to have like a museum of all the things we had before the fall. And he's putting these items out, and I'm like, oh, this probably is what becomes this thing in the future. But what's curious about this is that this character, Brian, that we saw on the plane at the start of the episode, he is like gone from the rest of the episode. I don't know if they specifically named him as one of the people who left early on. If they did, I didn't catch that. So I was looking for him for the rest of the episode, and he just wasn't there. But he seems to be the one who's a part of this museum in the future, assuming it's the same museum that it's been spoken about in the future. I suspect it probably is, because, otherwise, why set it up here if it's not going to be the same one? Unless there's a narrative reason for having 2 of these things. That is very curious, and I'm interested to see if we see like this airport again in the present day future timeline of the story. But I don't think I didn't notice him. Maybe I think at one point they mentioned that her like agent went off to do something. I think maybe we see him at the very start of the airport stuff, but then he disappears. So if anyone can explain if this episode made it clear why he disappeared, then by all means let me know in the comments, because I did not catch that. That's most of the episode. Obviously there is the relationship that might develop between Miles and Clark. Clark has a hard time when he finally hears all the voicemails that his partners left him, and it sounds like he didn't leave in the best of terms. They had a bit of a cold moment where he didn't hug him, he just sort of slapped him in the arm because he felt a bit miffed that he wasn't coming with him to Chicago. And now, after he finally gets a signal, after being at the airport for days, he hears all these voicemails where clearly his partner got sick and has died. And he breaks down, which makes it a little conflicting for him later in the episode when Miles leans in for a kiss and he kind of says, "No, I can't, I'm in mourning." But then he gets drunk and kisses him back at the party thing a little bit later, which not too much to say about it beyond just the idea of moving on. Like, very much at the start of all this airport stuff, no one is even accepting that the world's gone. But maybe by the end, a lot of them are accepting that we're in a new society now, we're in a new community, this is now our life, and we have to deal with that. That stuff was far more interesting for me, and I think Clark is a kind of a solid character to follow this through, because he's smart enough to make some important decisions and kind of step up when the time calls for it, because everyone kind of needs some kind of a leader, which is one of the things that Tyler challenges them on, is that why do we need a leader? And he's like, yeah, because the leaders give us hope, they give us structure, so on, so on. At the same time, he's not just this heroic dude who is like setting out to do the right thing. He steps up because someone needs to step up. He sees how things are going to crumble if no one steps up, and he does it because he has to. Which in some ways is the perfect person to be the leader, is the person who doesn't want to do it for the glory of being in charge, but just does it because they know it needs to happen. So I thought he was a compelling vessel for this episode. Whenever he like goes looking for stuff and he finds like, you know, the other toilet with the badge in it, or he goes exploring, finds a control tower, he was a good vessel to take us through this story. Partly because he's someone who knew Arthur, who was involved in the other stories, but was never like a major character in them. And it makes sense that he's been disconnected from all these characters. You know, Elizabeth especially, like, you know, he's seen her, you know, sometimes through Arthur, but not like often. So he's kind of a good vessel for the audience in that he's aware of the general idea of some of these other characters in some of the past, but he's not up to date in what they're going through right now. So he gets to ask questions, he gets to find out things with the audience as to what the current relationships that Arthur had with his ex-wife and his son, and so on and so forth. So all that I think is well handled. It's solid stuff. Obviously, there is a bit of exploration as to how both Hart and Clark both feel about Arthur. She, of course, is still very upset that Arthur ended up cheating on her, which, you know, I actually kind of stuck up for Arthur in episode 3 and said that because he settled down with the woman that he cheated on Miranda with, that maybe it was more influenced by Miranda being a withheld partner, and he was looking for someone who would be more loving. But the fact that he ended up cheating on Elizabeth as well does make him look quite bad and make him look like he's just a cheat. But, you know, with the information I had at the time, I felt fine to analyze it that way. Obviously, things have changed a little bit here. And then Clark, you know, talking about how he loved Arthur, but yeah, he got frustrated, and they talk about how Arthur was very charismatic. People paid attention to what he was saying, with him putting in no effort, where Clark has to really try. He has to yell. He has to give it everything he's got for people to just pay attention to him. And in a weird way, he's kind of found himself in this important role after the fact. It's almost a much healthier version of what the fake agent was doing. You know, the custodian who was presenting himself as a federal agent, or Homeland Security, or whoever he was pretending to be. And that Clark equally went from not being that important a person beforehand. You know, he was a mediocre actor, and we find out that he's been doing like consultant work for like CEOs, right? Like he wasn't that important before, but he's become important not because he's seizing the glory necessarily, although it is sort of presented in a way where he steps up and seizes it. It's more like he's more honest about who he was before. He's not pretending that he had this position of power before. but he's recognizing the people, he's recognizing the human qualities at the center of all this and seeing what they need, and he's stepping up and providing it. One could argue that it is still kind of a performance, but it's a performance that comes from a good place, that is realizing that it's needed, and maybe ties into the idea that on some level everyone is just performing to what they think everyone else needs around them, right? I think everyone has that feeling sometimes where they're putting on a show by being who they are in front of people, and the idea that you feel like you're faking it, and until someone says, no, you're actually this now, you've been faking it so long that this is who you are. You just didn't realize that you became the thing, as opposed to just pretending you're the thing. Anyway, I feel like I'm getting into a more philosophical ramble of what it means to be a person, or pretending to be the person you are, and where the truth starts and when the performance begins or ends. I don't know. Anyway, the show obviously has a lot of actors in it talking about acting and performing and how that's important, but maybe part of the whole idea is that even when we're not performing in a play, we're still performing to an extent for everyone else, and sometimes even performing to ourselves. So very curious to see where they go with this. I mean, there's some interesting themes here. I can't deny that, and I did like most of this episode. It's just the one element I didn't like was, I think, the part that I was supposed to be the most excited by the end, which was Tyler's origin of evil. It was giving me, not that he was acting the same way or had even similar plot, but it was making me feel a little bit about the way I felt in the remake of Halloween, where they tried to give you like the kid version of Michael Myers, evil looking the entire time. I don't know, I was getting some of those vibes from him, and it made them less interesting to me. But anyway, that's my thoughts on episode 5 of Station 11. We are halfway through the show, and hopefully the future stuff can perk me up a little bit and be the best of those episodes, because I have typically liked these episodes where it's been more set in the past, focused on a specific character or two, versus the future stuff with grown up Kirsten. So we'll see how it goes. But that is my thoughts. Thank you very much for joining me. You can, of course, support all the content by liking, subscribing, but especially going over to patreon.com/MailFuzzTV and supporting over there for however much you would like. But thank you once again. I do appreciate it. Keep watching TV. Have you got any vanilla?